podcast. I want to talk a little bit about risk management, particularly risk management strategy and a framework. Now, risk management strategy begins with understanding the organization's risk appetite. And what I mean by that is an information security risk strategy should always align with the risk strategy of the organization. This is the risk appetite is that level of risk that the company is willing to accept. That's not something for IT or for even the CISO to determine, or the virtual CISO. That's determined by the CEO and the board of directors. And it has to align with the business goals. This is really what information security is supporting, the business goals. It also aligns with the coverage limits. So there's any risk exposure that might go beyond the coverage limits for your liability or your cyber policy, that won't be acceptable. So I talked a little bit about risk appetite. What does that mean? So we need to talk about risk tolerance for particular losses. So losses that might be potentially in the future. So here's a couple of examples. If a CRM outage lasts 3 days, well, how does that impact operations? And therefore, how does that impact revenue coming in? What about ransomware? If ransomware shuts down the company and you're down for 2 weeks, what kind of financial impact do you have there? The company generates $100,000 a day as another example. Is a $300,000 loss acceptable? Notice each one of these risk appetites, it doesn't really focus on the nuances of cybersecurity, about threats and vulnerabilities. It's really what's important to the business, the board of directors and the CEO and the C-suite is the dollar amounts. How is this going to affect the bottom line? Now, merging those together helps security leaders prioritize then the remediation efforts and even the priority which you would remediate. Now, how can you prioritize? Well, you first have to start with identifying and categorizing the risks. So you can't categorize a risk if you don't know it, first of all. So you have to identify it. And then from there, you have to determine, well, what really makes the most sense to address first? Because you can't just go to your board of directors or your C-suite and say, these are 10 top risks here, and they all need to be taken care of. You, as the advisor, need to be able to help them make risk-informed decisions, rather. So we talk about risk. What kind of risk are we talking about? Well, one of the big ones out there, obviously, is third-party risks, and talking about vendors and partners. And we see that a lot, where sometimes you have a large organization that is impacted by a vulnerability, not directly, but from a small organization that is a vulnerability in their organization is exploited in order to jump over to the big organization. One of the watershed moments of that in the past is back in 2013 with Target, and it was a HVAC contractor up in Pennsylvania that was the small organization that was breached. Financial risks. So anything to do with purchasing, accounts receivable, accounts payable. Geographic risks. Well, are you in the place where there might be some sort of natural disaster, for example? Here in the mid-south of the United States, for example, this in the springtime is typically tornado season, so you have to account for that. Or it could be geopolitical in fighting going on, such as what's happened in Ukraine. Cybersecurity risks, of course, and we all know those as cybersecurity and information security professionals, data breaches, ransomware being a couple there. Now, it's important to understand that leadership may have concerns that might be specific and also perhaps different from the security officer's concerns. They really want to make sure that customer data is protected. And they also really need to make sure that business continuity is solid. Again, this is all about ensuring that the business does what the business needs to do in order to survive. And those sorts of concerns need to be factored into the risk assessments. When you're performing a risk assessment, you're not doing it in a silo or a vacuum. So you need to have a structured approach to doing this. So some elements here, we talk about, for example, I just mentioned business continuity. Well, business continuity begins with understanding the business impact to the organization. So what do you do in order to determine that? You perform a business impact assessment. We refer to that in the industry as BIAs. And a BIA simply will evaluate the financial and operational impact if there's a downtime for a particular business unit, or sometimes they do it all together. You can actually download a template from this course to help you create BIAs. Privacy impact assessments, kind of similar, but this is identifying the risk to the privacy of data that's out there. GDPR requires privacy impact assessments, for example. One of my favorite here is with regards to identifying and measuring and monitoring risks is interviewing the key stakeholders, because a lot of times the folks that are in charge of the business units, or those within the business units that are actually performing the business actions, they're the ones to better understand what the information security risks are. So you, as an advisor, want to be sure that you are in constant contact, well, maybe not constant contact, but definitely in contact with them, and make sure that they have the constant ability to contact you if they see a risk that may be important for information security, that may be something that they think that you need to know about. This is all about gathering insights on critical business functions. You can also download a template in this course to help you with that. But you can't protect and you can't assess risk on things you don't know, and this just helps you find that. All this is to help security teams quantify risks in terms of business terms and justify the needs for security investments. Now, a lot of times when you're doing risk assessments, you want to make sure that you're assessing against a particular information security framework. So, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework is common among small and mid-sized businesses. You get a little bit further up the size, and particularly a lot globally, you'll see ISO 27001. But you want to make sure that the organization has a framework chosen that aligns with their operations and their regulatory requirements. It doesn't make any sense, for example, to do a high trust framework if they don't handle health information, for example. All that frameworks do is that they guide how risks are identified, mitigated, and then constantly and continuously monitored. They provide a structure for your security program. So then once you have defined your risk appetite, talked about that just a few moments ago, and you've identified your risks, you've got to do something about those risks. There's several ways that you can treat a risk. One of the way is to reduce risk to acceptable levels. There are other options, and all are valid. Accepting a risk is valid as well too, so long as those who are making that decision, which would be the C-suite and the board of directors, that they have the appropriate information to make that risk-informed decision. But more often than not, organizations will want to try to lower the effect of risks as much as possible. So that comes the concept of controls. And I always like to say the controls are sort of the glue that keeps everything together. Controls help to not only mitigate your risks, they also map to certain frameworks. These controls can be technical, they can be managerial. So, for example, one would be that, let's just say your leadership determines that a 3-day outage, well, that's acceptable, or rather is unacceptable, but a 1-day outage would be fine. Then the security teams now, that's sort of a impromptu business impact analysis, if you will. The security teams need to make sure that they can create a disaster recovery program that can handle the backups, the recovery, and all of the controls to protect the information so that it doesn't exceed that 1 day. A little bit more into that would be RTOs and RPOs. It's a little bit beyond this particular segment. Security leaders then use this information to justify investments in technology, processes, and personnel. Now, risk management should always be integrated into the business decision-making, ensuring that security measures, they support growth, innovation, resilience without unnecessary friction. So one thing that the security team doesn't want to be is the office of no, so to speak, because we only exist as a security team to enable the business. We don't want to restrict that. And that's the hard part. The hard part is actually determining the best way to ensure that the business can do what it needs to do as lowered risk as possible. And that's what a well-structured risk management strategy allows organizations to do. You're balancing security with operational efficiency. That's how you get long-term success.